I'm Michael Lissack, the immediate past president of the American Society for Cybernetics. Today, I'm going to talk to you about sloppy science, when science is not done the way it should be, and what that means, and what it means from a systems and cybernetics perspective. The very term sloppy science came into being almost 20-something years ago when a prominent Dutch psychologist named Derek Stapel decided that the thing to do was to fabricate data for himself and many of his PhD students. Sloppy does not refer to fraud. It was not the fabrication of the data that was sloppy science. It was the attitude of his colleagues, both in academia and in the science communities in general. They accepted the fabrication. They failed to ask questions. They failed to apply rigor. They didn't want to see what there was behind and under rocks. Sloppy science is the acceptance of shortcuts, the failure to ask questions, and a lack of rigor. Sloppy science is dangerous. We live in an environment today that is marked by great uncertainties. COVID-19 and climate change have shook up the world. With COVID-19, we have asymptomatic carriers, we have an unknown transmission vehicle, we have economic lockdowns, we have a set of governments that don't know what to do. Things are very uncertain. And with climate change, it's even worse. What do we block? How do we block it? Is it meaningful? The changes that we're asked to make today won't even show up as meaningful for 10 or 20 years. So what should we do? Humans are very bad at dealing with uncertainties. And the sloppiness in sloppy science appeals to that because shortcuts and a lack of rigor allow certainty to appear where it does not belong. Uncertainties are not the same as ambiguities. Uncertainties are a lack of sufficient information so that there's a willingness to act. Ambiguities are when there's multiple values for the same thing. But yet again, sloppy science has a way of dealing with those ambiguities by sweeping them all under the rug. What counts is some pet theory, some overprivileged notion, a shortcut, arrived at without rigor, but asserted to be truth. Let me give you an illustration. About a month ago, I posted this little diagram that you see on LinkedIn. It has attracted more than 250,000 views, 5,000 reposts, hundreds of comments. What is most interesting is that everyone that sees it in comments seems to see something else in the diagram. They have their own explanation for what is going on. What they see is a story. They see the house, and somehow the house explains the four things before it. But with all due respect, that story is wrong. If you look carefully at the drawing, the Lego bricks are sorted by color, not by function, not by size. Somehow, magically, bricks that don't appear in the first four categories are in the final thing that we look at and say is a house. The yellow bricks seem to have disappeared. The distribution of the bricks by color seems to be very different. It is easy to look at this illustration and to say, ah, yes, the house explains what's going on. That is an example of sloppy science. You have allowed a pet theory to override your own powers of observation, and you failed to ask questions. What happened to the missing bricks? How did the color distribution change? Where did the bricks that are different shapes come from? All of that is swept aside with the notion of the house explains everything. But the house explanation is sloppy science. As I have said, sloppy science involves taking shortcuts, failing to ask questions, and not bothering with rigor. It is as if the Queen of Hearts, sentence first, verdict afterwards, has somehow taken over the notion of science itself. If you work toward a known sentence, If we work toward a known outcome, we can be very efficient, but in the process, we've adopted a set of blinders. We only see things that conform to the pre-existing sentence that we decided to impose, or to the shortcuts that we've taken, to the pet theory we've adopted, to the sloppiness that we've decided to ignore. Good science is very different. It asks questions at every step of the way. Good science accepts that any conclusion reached is but temporary. We treat that conclusion as if it had lasting durability, but it is only good until it is disproved or something better comes along. Good science depends on questions, it depends on method, and it depends on rigor. Let's talk about what it means to do good science. Good science starts when someone makes an unexpected observation. Confusion results, and good science is attempting to process how to deal with that confusion. The first question that is asked is, what should we be examining? There are many things that have been paid attention to. We have to pick out which things we're going to examine. Our attention span is limited. Our cognitive skills are limited. We cannot pay attention to everything. So the choice of what to examine is the first critical question. We then need to understand that there are constraints that have to be applied. Again, we have limited cognitive abilities, we have limited resources, we're in some kind of a context, we have some kind of time pressure. All of these things are constraints, and the constraints need to be laid out in an explicit manner. Similarly, when we go to make choices about variables, we are choosing from among some presuppositions. We ask, what is the correct unit of analysis? What kind of time period are we looking at? What kinds of relationships are we going to look at? Do we allow the subjects of our inquiry to talk to one another, or do we assume they did? Or do we assume they didn't? These kinds of presuppositions matter. We move on and we say we're going to explore relationships. What is it about the data that we've observed, the experiments we have conducted, the probing that we've done that suggests that item A is related to item B? This is the fundamental heart of our scientific query. To do this and to probe it fairly adequately, we create a set of models. The models are engaged in looking at what it means to say that A relates to B, that this context matters, that this doesn't. Models allow us to ask, what if? They allow us to make choices and to challenge things. Within the model, we will apply both inductive and deductive reasoning in order to say, this leads to that. If we do this, that happens. We begin to develop some notions of causality. Finally, when we have a good understanding of causality that backs up through many runs of the same model, we are ready to assign a label or a category and tell some narrative about what it is that we've observed. The goal of all of this was to explain or to place into context that unexpected observation. Telling that story is the key to the final step, which is then developing applications that make use of the story we just developed. This is science the way it was meant to be. The stages of that scientific query map very nicely into Dave Snowden's Cynefin framework. We start in the state of confusion, those unexpected observations. We then have to decide what it is we're going to examine. That's being creative. We then have to engage in a complex process of untangling what relationships matter, which ones seem to hold. And when we've got them modeled, we then can engage in unfolding the complicatedness that describes them. Finally, we try to come up with something clear, something that others can understand, the label, the category, the narrative that we've told. Cynefin works very well in describing the process of good science. And indeed, we can map each of the items that I had in my earlier diagram to the domains of Cynefin: confusion, creative, complex, complicated, and clear. Good science also makes explicit use of several things from cybernetics. Perhaps the most important is the notion of requisite variety. It is critical when examining any kind of a system that the number of variables that are available as choices to that which is purported to control that system be the same as the number of choices available to the system as a whole. Requisite variety is an understanding of matching. You're not going to get there by just assuming this or that. You figure out what the requisiteness is by going through the scientific process, by engaging in a process of matching. But the story you tell, the model you develop, will work far better when requisite variety is present. Another key cybernetic principle at work is that of least action. We're lazy. We will take the approach that gets us there the fastest, with the least effort. We need to be aware that that's just a human tendency and to fight against it. Rigorous science does not mean taking the path of least resistance. Rigorous science means challenging that path and seeing if there are alternatives that might lead you to something better, something perhaps even eventually more efficient. It is critical that we keep our tendency to take least action forefront as we examine which activities we do engage in and which ones we opt to neglect. It is also important that we don't treat the word model as just some kind of a picture. Cybernetics says that we need to be making explicit use of the Robert Rosen modeling relation. Models are opportunities for agency. They allow the scientist to make choices and to see the results of those choices. They're not static pictures of some state, this or that. They allow choice. Those that are familiar with my prior work have seen this picture before. This is a picture of what it means to have a good model. We perceive problems, consequences, and then we make a choice, the selection of relevant elements. We also then choose relationships, and we examine some set of actions against those relationships and those elements. We then see what happens if there's an intervention. Models are about these kind of choices, making them explicit and capturing what it means as you make changes and choices. Science involves this kind of model, not the drawing of some static picture, some truthy, some pet theory. Once we understand what good rigorous science is, it is possible to go back, look at our same diagram, and analyze the kinds of sloppy science that we find out in the real world. The first category of sloppy science is a simple one. We're just going to eliminate all the confusion by asserting that there's some category or label that takes hold. This is where the slogan, the meme, the viral truth, the truthy, all can govern. If you think back to that illustration that I posted on LinkedIn, this is where the assertion that the house was the story. This is sloppiness. There's no rigor here. There's a pet theory being adopted, proclaimed as the relevant category, and treated as if it were the truth. The second kind of sloppy science is what we call satisficing. When you've identified enough variables that you think you can explain what's going on, and you say, that's good enough, and you stop looking for alternatives, when you prematurely satisfice and you fail to exhibit rigor, you are being sloppy. And that sloppiness can result in really bad decisions. The world spent 6 months to a year warning about surface transmission of COVID-19 or fomites. There was no surface transmission. We ignored the role of ventilation and how things move through the air. Again, we had satisficed on the wrong variables. Sloppy science was allowed to prevail. The third category of sloppy science is to deliberately ignore the context in which an experiment, an observation, a decision, a conclusion are being reached. Everything that we do is a choice. We do not have the luxury of infinite possibilities. So we impose constraints. If we ignore our active role in imposing those constraints, and we refuse to figure out what role alternate constraints might play, we are allowing some pre-assumed context, the easiest one for us to deal with, to govern. It's pure sloppiness. That sloppiness carries over into the fourth variety. We need to be building models that are open to all kinds of challenges. We probably need to be building multiple models of a situation, a problem, and figuring out which one seems to be applying the best. But that's not efficient. If you choose to build a singular model built around some pre-chosen story, you are not being rigorous. You are being sloppy. A sloppiness that with COVID could kill. The fifth kind of sloppy science is perhaps the most complicated. When you have a universe of possibilities, applying some function to that universe is a complicated calculation. So we try to figure out what the average might be, but there are two ways to do the average. One is to apply the function to everything in the universe and average the results. The other is to find the average value of the set that we call the universe and apply the function to that average. Jensen's inequality says that unless the function is linear, those two numbers, the function applied to the average and the average of the function after its application, will be very different. We ignore Jensen's inequality at our own risk. In the social sciences, this is a mistake made all the time. Perhaps its worst example is when social scientists decide that a sample of one themselves is adequate. You cannot ignore Jensen's inequality. The two averages are simply not the same. Paying attention to Jensen, trying to figure out how to minimize the difference, that's rigor. Ignoring Jensen's inequality, that's simply sloppy science. The sixth form is sort of the opposite of the last one. When we assert that things belong to a category or a label, we are doing what linguists refer to as applying an indexical. An indexical is something that stands for a whole host of other things. For example, the Dow Jones Industrial Average is an index that we refer to as standing for the stock market. There are limits to indexicality. When we hit those limits, the application of the label or the category breaks down. What we're seeing in Europe and in the United States with regard to politics is the breakdown of traditional labels. Indexicality is not holding. Well, the same can happen in science. If we apply a category that's close, it's a metaphor, it's an analogy, but it isn't quite right, the indexicality will break. We need to probe the limits of indexicality if we're going to be rigorous. And to assume that an indexical, a label, a category, will always be a good description is simply sloppy. And then we get to the last category, perhaps the simplest, which is to be premature in applying conclusions, stories, understandings, things that were arrived at through sloppiness and making applications out of them. When you do that, you might get it right, and there might be a period of time where things seem to work. But the lack of rigor, the sloppiness, will catch up with you in the end. Premature applications of things poorly understood rarely results in good science, good technology, or good applications. Sloppy science is like allowing this baby to be typing away at the keyboard. Perhaps something brilliant will emerge, but it's dubious. Instead, you're just being sloppy. Sloppy science is dangerous. Rigorous science is what we need. The easiest way to understand when sloppy science is happening is to look for one of the three T's. Truthies, TLDR, which means too long, didn't read, or TCUSI, too complex, used a shortcut instead. The presence of any of the three T's suggests that there's sloppiness going on. The presence of all three of them, this isn't science. This is instead some kind of joke. There is an irony to the idea that Stephen Colbert, one of the 21st century's great comedians, is also one of our greatest philosophers. Colbert said that a truthy is that which feels like it's right. There doesn't need to be any correspondence with facts. There doesn't need to be any deductive reasoning that says this must be true. What matters is how it feels. If it feels right, it's a truthy, and it can be treated as if it were true. Rigorous science responds to that by saying BS. But sloppy science endorses truthies. In fact, they are the path to even more sloppy science. The first time I saw TLDR was when a student announced that they weren't going to read the assignment I gave because they just didn't have time. The assignment was all of 10 pages. TLDR is laziness. TLDR is the false assumption that you know enough already that you can judge just by looking at the packaging of something whether you should bother devoting the time and energy to read it. TLDR is a major source of what allowed Stapel to engage in the Slodderwetenschap that invented sloppy science in the first place. When people are unwilling to devote time and energy to rigor, sloppy science results. Truthies were invented by Colbert. TLDR has been around for, unfortunately, more than a decade. TCUSI, now that's a new one. I take credit for it. The abbreviation means too complex, used a shortcut instead. When we read newspaper articles, in fact, when we see much of what's in the media, TCUSI rules. When politicians use memes, TCUSI rules. When our students try to explain a complex subject by citing some label, some shortcut, some meme, something that they used instead of TLDR, TCUSI is what's going on. Sloppy science allows TCUSI. Too complex, used a shortcut instead. Rigorous science forbids it. If something is complex, the complexities need to be probed, outlined, and if they're going to be cordoned off with constraints, those constraints made explicit. It is simply unacceptable to say something is too complex, so you used a shortcut instead. That isn't science. It's comedy. Or maybe, in this world, it's tragedy. The only way to do battle with truthies, with TLDR, and with TCUSI is to ask questions. Questions are the key to good science. Good scientists ask questions. Of course, question asking can take many forms. We can engage in critical thinking. We can engage in data probing. We can directly ask, we can indirectly ask. We can gather data and do statistics. We could run around and ask people what it is they think of something. We could make observations and draw conclusions. But the key to all of it is to be asking questions, not to be assuming that some pet theory, some initial idea, some truthy has its own independent meaning. That assumption is what gives rise to sloppy science. Having a shortcut may be efficient. Having a shortcut or a pet theory allows you to apply filters. If we were a designer, it allows us to work backwards. But for science, having a shortcut is a problem. What is needed is to ask what it is that makes a given shortcut work. What lies behind the shortcut? What is it that's giving that shortcut meaning? Shortcuts depend on affordances. If you remember your Gibson, affordances are joint properties of a thing and its context. In this instance, the shortcut has meaning only because of the other things that surround it. So we must ask, what assumptions are being made? What context is the shortcut being employed in? What is it that affords meaning from inside the shortcut itself? What is it that evokes meaning from outside the shortcut? And to all of this, is there some kind of knowledge that is prerequisite for us to understand? Something that comes before. Affordances, the making a possibility exactly that, a possibility, are what give shortcuts their power. But shortcuts need to make those affordances explicit. When we don't know what the affordances are, when we don't know just what it is that lies behind a shortcut, that's when sloppy science happens. That's when truthies from Mr. Colbert happen. That's when confirmation bias kicks in. That's when all of the cognitive biases that you can find on a chart have an opportunity to kick in. Not knowing what it is that allows a shortcut to have meaning and to work is what gives rise to the risk. We need to make every shortcut's affordances explicit if we're going to have any form of rigor. In the absence of that explicitness, what you get is sloppy science. Hopefully by now you will agree with me. The world cannot afford sloppy science. Shortcuts are interesting, shortcuts are efficient, but shortcuts are dangerous. And when it comes to science, the lack of asking questions, the lack of rigor, endangers all of humankind. The time has come to say enough. We cannot accept the use of shortcuts that are not accompanied by questions, context, and some form of poking around for rigor. There simply is too much risk. Risks that in the era of COVID, of climate change, and even worse, we cannot and will not be able to endure. Unless we systematically stop the proliferation of sloppy science, our world is in danger. Our future is in danger. The time to end sloppy science, the time to begin asking critical questions, the time to teach everyone that when you see a shortcut, you must ask what it is that is behind it that gives it meaning. What is it that allows a shortcut to work? What cognitive shortcut is being taken that can be avoided, that can be explained, that can be probed? Asking questions is the key to our future. It is available online. And all I can say is thank you for listening, and hopefully you'll ask questions.